Hi everybody, it looks like Joy's having some technical difficulties, so I'll open up the session. Welcome everybody to the State and Sub-State webinar. Thanks everyone for making the time to be here, especially to our speakers, Mark Egan, Professor Kalish and Professor Edge. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and, getting a better understanding, for a perspective from both Crown dependency and an insight into both national and subnational parliaments and discussing that relationship further. What I'll do is I'll hand over to our first speaker to begin and kick us off. So Professor Peter Edge, if you would like to get your slides up and begin. Thanks so much.
I'm going to kick off. Quite a lot of my presentation time is going to be explaining the very specific context from which I'm coming from, which is from the Manx position. But hopefully it'll be able to feed into some of the broader issues you want to talk about a little later. So the Isle of Man is shown here to scale. As you can see, it's in the middle of the Irish Sea between the UK and Ireland. We frequently get assumed to be somewhere rather nearer to mark between the UK and France, but this is where we are. I'm going to talk about the distinctive history of the Isle of Man because it is very relevant to the current constitutional position, and then talk about the current relationship, the relationship between Tynwald, the Manx legislature and Parliament, and also between Tynwald and the UK government. I'm not going to spend much time, or indeed any time, on the international treaties side of things. The Isle of Man does exercise some treaty-making power, but it's actually the executive, not the legislature, which is involved. So if we want to talk about that, I can discuss that during the general discussion. And then I'm going to finish with two broader reflections, which is the potential for informality as a resource for gradual change, but also for fragility, and the power of nearby models from a large state versus a move towards a more democratic, more distributed idea of models. So, by 1399, the Isle of Man had entered the dominions of the English crown by conquest, but was granted to feudatory monarchs. Basically, the English king had no great interest in adding it to the realms of England, so instead it was given as a reward to powerful English nobles that the king wanted to keep sweet. So we have a number of dynasties of lords of man. Before the mid-1700s, there was really very little English or British interest in what the Lords of Man did, except during the English Civil War. It was so removed from the centre of their interests that really they just let them get on with it. But in the mid-1700s, things rather changed. This is a picture of what the English categorised as smuggling and the Manx categorised as trade. So there was evasion of English duties on a industrial does not come close to it, on a massive scale, which was lawful in Manx law and unlawful in English law. And the difficulty was that by having this sort of by having this feudatory lord, it was quite difficult for the English crown to negotiate a way of dealing with that. So we had the revestment of 1765, where pretty much all of the lord's rights were purchased by the British crown. Now, what I want to stress was that this was pretty much entirely a negative development by the British crown. They didn't want to do anything with the Isle of Man. They simply wanted to stop it being used for this massive loss of revenue. And obviously, if we think about international finance centres, there are some interesting historical resonances there. So because the British strategic goals were so minimalistic, revestment basically left internal laws and forms of government largely untouched, because the British government was not interested in governing the Isle of Man in any profound sense. So as part of this, one of the key organs left intact was Tynwald, which is the central organ of Manx government, which combined many functions. At various times in history, it's been a court, a legislative body, the centre for the executive. The focus I'm going to do today is on the legislative side of things. Now, post-revestment, the British government imposed parliamentary legislation more often. It had pretty much it had been able to since 1399, and I can give you examples before 1765, but basically come revestment, the British Parliament is much more likely to extend acts of Parliament passed in Westminster to the Isle of Man. But the primary mechanism used to make sure Manx law was in compliance with imperial interest was actually Acts of Tynwald. So the already established national organ was used. And because this was left intact, the 20th century actually saw a nationalisation of governance, where these institutions were brought back into Manx control. We see an increasing use of purely Manx institutions to govern, so less and less is seen as an imperial issue. And we also see a shift in the composition and function of those institutions from no longer being accountable and appointed from the UK, but accountable and appointed from the Isle of Man. Now, this governance and these shifts in governments were influenced, but not always in step with broader imperial Commonwealth developments. So there are some fantastic similarities and rhymes between what's happening in the broader possessions of the British Crown and the Crown dependencies. There are some significant differences. And Tynwald submitted to a substantial constitutional review in 1973 a view of their understanding of the relationship with the UK. And they said, it seemed, therefore, that the United Kingdom government's policy differed according to whether it was the Home Office or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which held responsibility for the future of independency. For those remote in distance and aloof in sentiment, one policy, a policy of self-determination and self-government. But for the near and the steadfastly loyal, another policy, a policy of denial. So Tynwald was aware of what was happening as part of decolonisation, and it was aware of what was happening in the BOTs, which very late developed responsible government, and it felt that the Isle of Man was losing out. So there are some distinctions here. So I feel I have to cover that very distinctive constitutional history to make sense of the current relationship. So Tynwald and Parliament. So the relationship between what in terms of this seminar could be seen as a sub-national legislature, the Tynwald, and the national legislature, the UK Parliament. Pre-20th century, it was absolutely clear that parliamentary sovereignty applied in a hierarchy. Tynwald could pass Acts of Tynwald in relation to the Isle of Man. Parliament could pass Acts of Parliament which extended to the Isle of Man, and where there was any clash whatsoever, the Acts of Parliament would always prevail. Good old-fashioned 19th century high point views of parliamentary sovereignty. And sometimes this was interpreted very broadly, so not simply Tynwald could not legislate contrary to, but Tynwald could not legislate in an area where Parliament had already begun to intervene. And so, for instance, the draft Manx Criminal Code of 1872 was initially rejected because post office legislation extended to the Isle of Man, and the code contained some criminal offences around interfering with the post. By the end of the 20th century, however, Tynwald had begun to actually repeal Acts of Parliament. So I don't mean that they were repealing Acts of Parliament as they applied to England, but they were repealing them as they applied to the Isle of Man. So the Merchant Shipping Act 1981 repealed a number of Acts of Tynwald, possibly without much consideration. There's certainly no evidence of consideration in legislative debates, and politicians of the era I've talked to said they hadn't really thought about the issue. But by 1991, the Merchant Shipping Act repealed another Act of Parliament, and it was explicitly acknowledged it was doing so during the passage of the Act. So in that 10 years, what may almost have been an error had become much more confidently asserted by Tynwald. Massive change. So where did the court stand on this? The earlier view, I think you can find in Reeve Robinson, which is the decision of the Manx courts. It is, however, not contended if, as a fact, imperial acts and measures do apply to the island, either in whole or in part, that the insular legislature could affect any limitation or alteration of that application. So when you have an Act of Tynwald and an Act of Parliament which are not compatible, you always give priority to the Act of Parliament. But by re-CB Radio in 1981-3, which was a decision of the staff of government, the Manx Court of Appeal, it had changed. Since the consent of the sovereign is required before acts of either legislature become law, it must follow that the later act, whether of Tynwald or Parliament, must prevail. So where you have a clash, you look at the dates, not the institution creating it. So it's the development of what I've called a coordinate jurisdiction, where you have two peers in relation to the Isle of Man only, both of whom are capable of creating legislation. We could criticize seriously the theoretical underpinnings for this particular justification for it, but I think it's the current law. What about Tynwald and the UK government? Well, the UK government advises on giving or withholding royal assent. It's not a decision of the Manx executive. And before the 21st century, before the late 20th century, this was done routinely. And you find lots of reasons why this is done. Into the 20th century, the UK government is only really prepared to do this to protect good governance, or because there's an international legal obligation which will be violated by the Act of Tynwald. It became so routine, it's actually been delegated from the British Crown to the Lieutenant Governor, who is the representative of the Crown in the Isle of Man. And I've given a list of the reasons, the particular areas which should be reserved for the sovereign. Additionally, the governor can actually say, I know this isn't covered by these areas, but I'm not sure about this. I think this is a bigger issue than I want to deal with, and can reserve it for the Crown. So these are, as you can see, really issues which are extra territorial. They go beyond the borders of the Isle of Man. Defence, international relations, nationality and citizenship, the Lieutenant Governor, the relationship between the Isle of Man and the UK, the sovereign personally, or the royal prerogative. So let me finish with a couple of reflections on this. The first thing which in a seminar where we are talking about federalism is, I think, really striking, is how very informal the relationship between the Isle of Man and the UK has been. And this really reflects the sort of the texture of the constitutions of the UK and the Isle of Man during this period. And one point I would really like to stress is that a codified relationship any time between 1980 would not have given Tynwald coordinate authority with Parliament. There was no constitutional debate suggesting it had that authority. There was no cases supporting it. There was no constitution. There was no legislative practice. So the informality actually gave the potential for the Isle of Man's autonomy and self-governance to develop and grow, and for the authority of Tynwald vis-a-vis Parliament to increase. But against that, you have the danger of informality as fragility. And colleagues such as Mark in particular will know that there was serious parliamentary discussion of compulsory legislation, an Act of Parliament extended to the Isle of Man against the desire of the Manx government as part of actions against tax havens and sort of a global engagement with our international finance centres. Now, re-CB radio might suggest, well, what would happen then is you'd have an Act of Tynwald reversing it. You know, Parliament does something which is rejected by Tynwald, Tynwald reverses it by an Act of Tynwald. The trouble is that the power of royal assent remains ultimately under the control of the British government. So if that was to happen, what would actually happen would be that the Act of Tynwald purporting to reverse this policy would not be given assent. It would not become law. So I feel that informality has been incredibly useful in terms of development autonomy, the power of Tynwald vis-a-vis Parliament, but we may have reached a point where the Isle of Man should consider taking its winnings and leaving the table, actually sort of letting the position become more formal, because it is such a high water of autonomy, very little short of independence. If the UK or a successor state moves towards a written constitution, and I could quite imagine the breakup of the UK leading to sort of much more formal constitutional arrangements in this archipelago, that might be a good moment for the Isle of Man to formalise the current relationship and formalise the relationship between Tynwald and Parliament. And my other reflection is that until the late 20th century, English models were taken as the right models for Manx legislation. So what you see in the Isle of Man in particular is the longer there is direct government of the Isle of Man, the closer Manx law begins to look like English law. Not necessarily because of any strong policy initiative from the UK, but rather because it becomes the natural model, the go-to. And my favourite quote here is from Samuel Norris, who is a noted advocate for Manx autonomy, a really strong supporter of Manx autonomy, who in legislative debates in 1935 said, we should know, and the public should know, where we are varying, if we do vary from the English law, and the reason for which the variation is made. So really up until the 60s and 70s, there was an automatic, unthinking adoption of English legislative models. So Acts of Parliament, you will find, are passed in 1935, 1940. They don't go horribly wrong. 3 or 4 years later, the Isle of Man adopts it as an Act of Tynwald. Why are those English models less dominant now? Because they clearly are. I think part of it is political. there is more political willingness to consider models from outside of England, and you will find Tynwald actually engaging in some quite wide-ranging search for models when they're considering reforms to their own law. And the Abortion Act, I think, is something which the process, because it was quite a contentious process and quite a long process, there was a lot of consideration of other models. I'm sensing, and I think this is something I'd be really interested in Mark's views in particular, on the growth of a network rather than a hub spoke. So rather than the Crown dependencies in particular communicating just to Westminster and getting things back from Westminster, looking to England for models and getting them back, I think there is a much more network model gradually developing. The growth of the CPA CIMR, I think, is very interesting there. And I think the recognition of some common interest of Crown dependencies in relation to the UK, and instances when there's been group meetings and negotiations, and an awareness that there's a collective interest. And then the other reason I think there's been a shift is very pragmatic. Greater internal drafting resources in Tynwald. There is actually a drafting team that didn't used to be. It was literally the AG. And so it is actually possible for there to be more bespoke and more fine-tuned drafting than there used to be. And I think what I found really interesting is that in the pandemic, previous national emergencies, including both world wars, were dealt with by imperial laws being imposed in the Isle of Man with Manx consent. The pandemic has been dealt with by a very distinctive and Tynwald powered and approved set of emergency provisions under the Manx Emergency Powers Act 1936. So you have seen a shift there from reliance upon the state, the national level legislature, to much more autonomy and much more individual decision making. So a bit of a whistle stop, particularly since I had from the 13th century in one of my slide titles, but that's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Look, I just wanted to thank those that have joined us, and Peter for kicking off this really valuable discussion as we look at the relationship between national and sub-national parliaments. Where we will next hear from Mark Egan and Mr. Kalesh, but it really is an interesting discussion, and it reminds me it doesn't matter how developed we are, north, south, east and west, the relationship between national and sub-national is an ongoing development, as we've just heard from Peter, and will continue to develop it. So it's really important for CPA to provide these opportunities as we move forward. And just to remind those online that when we finish with speakers, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers as well. And with that, I'm quite happy to move to Mark Egan for the second presentation.
Thank you for this opportunity today. I'm going to move to a different Crown dependency, and I'm going to start in 1204, so I'm beating Peter there. I think I can't make a presentation about Jersey and its relationship with the United Kingdom without talking about what a Crown dependency is, and that will not be a repetition of what Peter said, because the traditions and the history are very different. So what is Jersey's relationship with the UK? Well, Jersey was historically part of Normandy in France. We are 15 miles or so from France, much, much further from the UK. And when the Norman conquest of England took place in 1066, that was the first time that Jersey was united with the English crown. At that point, the English crown and the Dukedom of Normandy were the same thing. Matters changed over time, and in 1204 there was a split, and for reasons that are lost to history, Jersey chose to remain loyal to the English crown rather than to go back to their neighbours in Normandy. So Jersey's never been part of England, it's never been part of the United Kingdom. We have our own legal and political systems, completely separate from the English system, and very influenced by French or Norman customs. And we have our own parliaments, the States Assembly, and that's what I'm the clerk of. That's why I'm here today. We are financially self-sufficient. I think that's really important to emphasise in terms of relationships with the UK. We don't receive any funding from the UK Treasury. The public expenditure in Jersey is funded from within Jersey. So to talk about the relationship with the UK government, rather as Peter alluded to for the Isle of Man, there is no single document which I can point to say, well, there you go, that sets out the relationship between Jersey and the UK. There are a patchwork of ancient treaties going back to the 14th or 15th centuries from monarchs reissued by different monarchs over time to establish in the language of the day the autonomy of Jersey from England and then from the United Kingdom. So they are very much in terms of the protection of local liberties and customs and in particular the ability of the island to raise its own taxation. So there were quite a few of those, and there's also a lot of custom and practice over the years. And I think it's important compared to what Peter was talking about to say that it's never been accepted that UK legislation would apply in Jersey, except with the consent of our Parliament, the States Assembly. So there was never a time when legislation was applied to Jersey without much thought. So therefore, there was never a moment when the island decided to break free of that. The island's always been separate, and any attempt over the years to legislate for Jersey without Jersey's consent has been resisted. So what does the UK do? Well, it's responsible for the defence of the island, and that's quite a big deal because for many years, the Jersey was on the contested border between England or the United Kingdom and France. And indeed, just across the road from where I'm sitting now is one of the last ever military battles on what might be considered to be British soil, the Battle of Jersey of 1781 in the Royal Square here. So unsurprisingly, defence was a big deal and is the UK's prime responsibility for the island. And the UK can sign treaties and international agreements on behalf of the island, but they are extended to Jersey with the agreement of the states. That's an important caveat. We do have our own external relations function now. It's increasingly active. It can sign agreements on behalf of the island, and it represents the island's interests both with the UK government and with, for example, the European Union. So moving on, the Assembly here has the full powers of a normal Parliament, but all the primary legislation which is passed here must be approved by the UK Privy Council before it takes effect. So in effect, that means that the UK government has the opportunity to check that legislation. A memorandum is sent with every piece of primary legislation to explain the provisions and also in particular to point to how compliance has been achieved with the UK's international obligations, particularly human rights law. In my time here, what it promotes is a dialogue between the Jersey government and the UK government when there are any legislative provisions that may engage those international agreements or indeed engage principles of good governance in general. It would be very unusual, I think, for the UK government via the Privy Council to refuse to accept a piece of primary legislation, but there have been instances of requests, if you like, for particular provisions to be looked at again, just to ensure that they're internationally compliant. And it adds an element of delay to the legislation process. UK legislation can be extended to Jersey, but it has to be done with the consent of the States Assembly. So when it happens, there is a motion in the Assembly to agree to that extension. And that applies in relation to things like immigration control, because we have a common travel area with the UK. So we have to have the same immigration controls. Civil aviation, similarly, we share airspace, regulation of broadcasting, things like that. Moving on to the parliamentary context, the formal links with the UK Parliament are actually pretty limited, and mostly via the CPA, which is a very important institution for Jersey and for the States Assembly. So, for example, at the start of a new Assembly term, members of scrutiny panels, our equivalent of select committees, will routinely go off to Westminster to talk to their counterparts to help learn the ropes. We send members to the CPA's UK's Westminster seminar on a regular basis in the days when you could send people to places rather than do it in this way. and we are very active within our region, and we have set up a Crown Dependencies network for the different Crown Dependency branches to talk to each other, as Peter alluded to. There is an all-party group in Westminster on the Crown Dependencies and Overseas Territories. So that brings together MPs and members of the House of Lords who are interested in the Crown Dependencies and the Overseas Territories. And that is an interesting and important sounding board of parliamentarians for Jersey. But it's important to look at the drawbacks of that approach. It's an informal network. The bringing together of Crown Dependencies and Overseas Territories isn't necessarily always ideal because they are different. And I've just included there a headline and the start of a story from the Jersey Evening Post in 2017 when the chair of that parliamentary group called for Jersey to have direct representation in the House of Commons, which would be anathema to the Jersey political system because it would cut across that constitutional separation from the UK, which has been the hallmark of the island's position for centuries. I should say that's the parliamentary context. There is a close working relationship between ministers, both ministers here and in the UK. There is a particular minister who's appointed to look after Crown Dependencies, and the government departments here in the UK work closely together. But from a parliamentary point of view, it is rather more distant. So I just want to finish by drawing attention to some recent issues where the relationship between Jersey and the UK has been interesting, I would say. So one is Brexit. Jersey, the Crown Dependencies were never formally members. Certainly, Jersey was never formally a member of the European Union, along with Guernsey. But our relationship with the European Union was governed by a protocol which attached to the agreement between by which the UK joined the European Union back in the 1970s. So when the UK left, that agreement left, and new arrangements have had to be put in place. And there were difficulties there because Jersey people didn't have a vote in the referendum. They weren't able to express a view. So this is something which happened to Jersey. And of course, Jersey wasn't at the table in the negotiations between the UK and the EU. So the negotiations as they affected Jersey took place at one stage removed. To reflect the constitutional separation of the island from the UK, there was a special sitting of the Assembly last Christmas on the Sunday after Christmas, exceptionally, to consent to the deal that had been done between the UK and the EU. But it's a moot point what would have happened if the states had decided they didn't like it, because that deal itself came into force a few days later. Fish, I've put up some festive lobsters because lobsters are a mainstay of the local fishing economy. Because we're so close to France, there is shared fishing grounds and water between Jersey and French fishers. And the changes to the relationship with the EU have disrupted the previous arrangements and agreements that were in place. And so Jersey's become something of a front line again between the UK and France in relation to how fishing is managed. And again, that relationship between Jersey and the UK comes into play because it's the UK government which signs agreements with France and which has to represent Jersey's interests, but Jersey's interests may not be always entirely aligned with the UK's. Tax, Peter's alluded to, we have a separate taxation regime. It's different from the UK. Jersey sometimes is characterised as a tax haven. There are demands to change tax policies here or to open up registers of beneficial ownership of property and assets. And sometimes they will spill over into the UK Parliament with demands for the UK simply to legislate for Jersey and force Jersey to do things that it doesn't want to do. And the honest answer to that is Jersey would resist, but it would, in the end of the day, be a matter for the courts to decide what the dividing line would be between the UK and Jersey in terms of whether the UK could impose that legislation, but it would have serious constitutional ramifications for the island. Finally, COVID, as Peter alluded to, the island, like the Isle of Man, managed COVID in its own way. We didn't bring in UK legislation. All the legislation was drafted here, and we took a different approach to our management to COVID, to Guernsey, for example, and different to the UK. So we have different restrictions in place at different times. And one thing that's of interest here is that during the COVID period, and I think it still applies at the moment, we took on the ability to make our own primary legislation as long as it was relating to COVID. So with the agreement of the UK Privy Council, i.e. the UK government, was pushed to one side, and the Jersey was able to directly legislate for itself in relation to COVID matters. And there is interest in looking at different models for royal assents, looking at the Isle of Man model, for example, rather than to always have to go through the Privy Council. And that is a matter for some debate in the years ahead, I think. And that is all I have to say on Jersey. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's quite informative to get already the different perspectives of two different areas where we think are closely aligned with the UK, but internally you have very different approaches and history and abilities, indeed, foresight to how you deal with things. So thank you, Peter and Mark. We'll move to our last presenter, who will talk about the capacity again of national and subnational legislations producing quality legislation. So I'll call on Mr. Kailesh, please. Welcome aboard.
From the keynote, I understand that the discussion was supposed to be happening at two levels in the context of India. One was about the functioning of parliaments, both at the national level and the sub-state or subnational level. Second, we were to look at the relationship between different levels of parliament, that is between the federal parliament and subnational parliament. Now, what I will do here is that I'll attempt to link the two and also to understand or underscore the process, that is the challenges that federal and state legislatures face when it comes to acting for the benefit of citizens that they represent. So I will flag 2 points here for your consideration. And in this context, it's based on my understanding or reading of the Indian experience. First, both the functioning of parliaments, that is at the state level or at the federal level, and as well as the relationship between the two levels has depended a great deal on political parties. Okay, and most specifically, I think the party system dynamics has played an important role, both the nature of the relationship that the two levels have, as well as what happens within the legislature. However, before I go forward, I must mention that legislatures in India at multiple levels have become more representative compared to the past. Today's parliament, today's legislatures represent a greater social heterogeneity or a diversity compared to earlier parliaments. Okay, so today our parliaments, were at any level, at any state, are more representative of the Indian population as compared to the past. And I think here political parties have played a very important role in bringing about this transformation and also bringing into play different groups who were hitherto left out or marginalized in Indian society. Now, as political party competition changed, as India moved from a dominant one-party system or a one-party dominant system to a more competitive multi-party system, this also had an impact on the working of parliaments. Okay, so in the literature, what we find is that as party fragmentation increases, one expects that it will impinge on the working of parliaments. Okay, it will impinge on the working of legislatures as well as on the relationship between the different levels that we have. So basically, one could think of two expectations. One, as there is greater fragmentation, one should expect that there would be chaos, there would be disruption, and there could be instability. On the other hand, you could also expect that this might provide greater opportunity for discussion, debate, and therefore increase the scope for accountability. Now, when we look at the Indian experience, I find a very strange paradox. Okay, so on one hand, there is this wide variation in terms of what's happening at the state, at the subnational level. That is, no two states look alike. They're very different from each other when it comes to this. Then the particular issue that was flagged to me was about the quality of legislation. I think it is very difficult to sort of measure quality of legislation, but there have been other indicators that have often been used as proxies to measuring how effective parliaments are or how effective legislatures are. So one of the issues that have been used in the context of India has been looking at in terms of the duration of meetings, on how many sittings parliaments have particularly had. Has there been a decline decline over a period of time, or have some parliaments met more often compared to the past? Another way in which people have sort of measured parliament has been in terms of the output, in terms of legislation. Has legislation increased, or has there been a variation in terms of the legislative output of parliament? I understand that it is very difficult to actually measure parliament's effectiveness in terms of output or in terms of sitting. So I'll just keep it aside. So, and I will therefore not look at quality, but I look at factors that have an impact on quality. And here I come to the party competition that we are focusing on. So when you look at the state legislatures and look at their working, you find that as fragmentation has increased, as more parties get into parliament, get into those state legislatures, you find that there is this number of sittings that they have has declined. Okay, so as fragmentation increases in many state legislative assemblies across the country, the number of sittings have declined. So legislative assemblies actually meet for shorter durations, and there is a longer gap between different sessions of parliament or the legislature. Of course, as I said, not all states are function in the same way. So you have Kerala in the south and Himachal Pradesh in the north, where there has not been much change. The average sittings have remained constant for a fairly long period of time. Whereas you look at some of the larger states, let's say like Maharashtra or Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Gujarat, even Karnataka in the south, there has been a decline. Now, what explains this? One may expect that ruling parties do not want to expose themselves to scrutiny and hence have shorter durations, have lesser number of sittings, so that they don't face the opposition that is there. Now, I just want to bring another picture here, and that's where the paradox is. Now, in India's current parliament, you have one dominant party which has the numbers in parliament. Yet, what we see, if we were to compare, say, the last three federal parliaments, you find that a trend where bills are not being subject to scrutiny as in the past. The number of bills that are introduced that are going to committees for extra scrutiny has been declining. For instance, we are now in the 17th Lok Sabha. Okay, so in the 15th Lok Sabha, 71% of all legislation that was introduced went to committees for scrutiny. Whereas in the subsequent Lok Sabha, that is the 16th Lok Sabha, only 27% of the legislation went for scrutiny. And in the current parliament, it is actually gone down. Okay, it's just not, committees are just not being used for scrutiny, for examining bills. Now, so, and at the same time, the government sort of very often claims that our output in terms of parliamentary output, in terms of legislation, is much higher than any previous parliament. So how do we then measure quality, or on what basis are we sort of speaking of differences between parliaments, differences between parties? So in the first session of the current Lok Sabha, 28 bills were passed in one session, and this was the highest that happened in the recent past. Okay. Now, this is not a party-specific phenomenon. That is, it is not the current party which is in power which has actually set in motion this sort of a setup. If you were to compare, let's say, two governments before, which was led by the Congress party, in one session of parliament, in half an hour, 8 bills were passed. This was just before the general election. So it is therefore not parties in terms of specific parties that are behaving in a particular way to make parliament function in this particular manner, but it is also across political parties. We see that the behavior seems to be the same. So this brings out sharply, I think, the focus that we need, at least in the context of India, the role of political parties, because representatives come, get their seats, get their tickets through political parties, and their functioning, I think, depends on what party strategy. And therefore, parties exercise a great control over its members, and what happens within the party or what parties decide is what happens then in parliament. So the contingencies of party politics matter much more than anything else when it comes to functioning of legislatures. Now, when it comes to, say, relationship between different levels of government and their legislatures, again, it is party politics and party systems that matter. For instance, if you have congruent governments with same parties at both levels, then relationships seem to be more cordial. But the moment you have incongruent governments, and then government opposition relations sort of impinges on federal democracy, then federalism is pushed aside and it becomes more about government and opposition. So when we compare both state and federal parliament, we see that when governments have a majority, they appear to ride roughshod over in parliament. And when they are not in a position to control parliament, they shortcut parliament. Okay, so either way, it is parliament which is suffering. Now, the second point that I'll flag, and I'll finish soon, is I think in a way links to what Professor Edge mentioned about informality as a resource and informality as fragility. Okay, so in India, what we see is that there is a gap between setting up of institutions and mechanisms and working of those institutions. There is no dearth of ideas when it comes to how to set things right. So we have new mechanisms being set up, new institutions being set up. However, often institutions are set up to serve symbolic goals. There is no investment in the institutional working. No political party has invested energy into making those institutions work. Consequently, what we have here is that, and that's sort of the fragility that is there, is that institutions do not become a solution to recurrent problems. So you constantly have the same problem coming up in spite of having some institution which was supposed to set right that. There is no consensus on the value of institutions, because immediately it becomes a government opposition sort of notion, and therefore it's your institution, you set it up, so it's not going to work. Okay, so institutions have therefore not habituated actors to work in a particular direction, direction to solve issues, which what the institution was meant to do. Consequently, we do not have any stable pattern of institutions. So you have institutions, but no institutionalization. So in the Indian Constitution, or let's say there's an Article 263, which allows you to set up institutions of intergovernmental relations. So in 1990, an interstate council was set up. Now, over the past 30 years, this council has met only 11 times. And it has met more often when we have had a coalition government at the center, and not when you have had one of the polity-wide political parties in control of the government. Now, if one looks at our Constituent Assembly debates, there is a clear line of thought that runs through the debates that parliamentary institutions, both at the center and at the state level, were to be the fulcrum around which parliamentary democracy in India was to resolve. Now, looking at the way in which both the federal parliament as well as state legislatures work across the country, we seem to be sort of moving away from those goals, those vision that is there in the Constituent Assembly, as well as what it was sort of thought that how these institutions will work. Now, Parliament in India, that is the federal parliament, has actually set standards. Now, if it does not sort of live up to it, states are likely to imitate what is happening at the federal level. Consequently, I see that we cannot expect states to set the standards, but we should expect federal parliament to sort of stand up and live up to the vision that is there in the Constitution. So with these, I will end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the three presenters for that quite informative and somewhat thought-provoking look at the difference between national and subnational parliaments. We'll move to Q&A, and I think we have about 40 odd minutes left with Q&A. And so please, members, I ask that you come put your comments or questions through the chat line, those that are online, or indeed raise your hand. In all else fails, just butt in true Australian style, please do. But before we move to Q&A, I just want to share with you the currency of this debate within two territories of Australia, that's the ACT and the Northern Territory, that we are bound by what we refer to the Andrews Bill that came in probably 25 years ago, which limited only the territories, not the states, but only the two territories in their decision-making, particularly around end-of-life choices. So the Commonwealth can override and indeed prevent us from even having the conversation. So there is a very active political movement across the two territories looking at territory rights. So, you know, that is just a little bit of local context for our members across the place. But I'd like now to move to Q&A. There are some questions that I've picked up, and then there are some more formal questions. But you know, to Mark Egan, that you said, you know, going back many a century to, you know, 1204, where you've been quite independent. What happens if Jersey decides something that is different to the approach in UK, given that you self-determine, but you still have the need to have your laws approved by the UK government? What happens if there's a contradiction between the two?
Well, there often is. The Jersey's got a separate legislative code. Its whole law code is based on is set up on a different basis to the England and Wales. So our whole legal basis is a mix of Norman and English law. But in many respects, the law is different here. Taxation is completely different. The States has just agreed in principle, a regime for assisted dying, just picking up on your earlier remarks, which would make Jersey the first jurisdiction in the British Isles to have that ability. I think if I look at assisted dying, we haven't got the legislation yet, so it hasn't gone to the Privy Council. But one of the principles that's been established is that the assisted dying would only be available for people resident in Jersey. Now, I think if the states had agreed that it could be available to anybody, the British government might have had some concerns about that, because there are many people in the UK who might want assisted dying, might not wish to be in position to pay to go to places like Switzerland, but would they come to Jersey? And I think there would be a conversation. But ultimately, Jersey law is completely different to UK law. We do pick up examples of UK legislation in some areas, like Peter was saying. Sometimes UK legislation can be the model for what's being done. In Jersey, quite often it isn't, and the decisions that are taken here are different. So the question doesn't really arise. We are very different.
Which, and just on that topic of dying with dignity, that we here in the ACT cannot even have the discussion. We're prevented from even having the discussion. Where 15 kilometres to my north is New South Wales, and they've just passed the bill. a few hundred kilometres south, they've just passed the bill. And so it is a contradiction that is unique to us and has been in place for 25 years. Probably the Northern Territory was ahead of its time, but I think us being able to have the discussion is quite contemporary and should be allowed. But it's one of the local things. A question to Peter. You made changes. You were saying that in some ways you have this informal arrangement and benefits with law passing. What's the benefits of formalising it and what's the benefits of keeping it informal, Peter?
My view is that Manx autonomy is pretty much a high watermark. If you sort of look back at any point before, certainly the development of responsible government in the 1980s, you find a decrease in autonomy and more not only being theoretically exercisable from London, but actually being exercised from London. So my view on the benefits of informality so far is they have let the tide rise. We're now at a high water mark where really the only way to have more autonomy is to shift to something which looks very much like independence, which is a matter for political debate. And the UK governments have consistently said that if that's what the Isle of Man wants, that's what the Isle of Man can have. But at the moment, it's quite a good deal, I have to say, for the Isle of Man in many ways. As Mark will know, there's currently a bit of a controversy about the amount of money we pay the UK government for defence and consular services, because it's much more than Jersey and Guernsey pay per capita. So I think the benefit of informality has been that autonomy has been able to grow that way without actually having to have those formal, sharp, legislative moments necessarily. My concern is that what is developed through informality can equally recede through informality. So, for instance, Mark alluded, as well as I had, to the suggestion that there should be intervention in the internal taxation laws of the Crown dependencies, which have been an area that we've exercised autonomy in for more than decades, for a very long time indeed. And it's quite difficult to point to something which categorically, in the case of the Isle of Man, would prevent that from happening. So I suppose I have a particular stance which emphasises the autonomy of the Isle of Man. And from that perspective, then to me, the benefit of formality would be, you come to the table, you've got your winnings on the table, take them. This is actually not a bad moment to lock down that relationship in terms of formality. Now, if you took a less partisan approach, you might say, well, actually, maybe that informality is good intrinsically, because now the UK in an increasingly globalized world can reel back autonomy of these territories for which they are responsible. But that's my view.
As you said, it's always betwixt and between. Doesn't matter whether we're looking at it from a parliamentary aspect or a political aspect. Which takes me to my final point before I go to some other questions. And please, those online, don't hesitate to come through the chat or raise your hand. Mr. Kalish, you spoke around, in many ways, the challenges that depended on political, and I'll use the word political, relationships between parties. Do you think, and I wasn't quite clear whether you were saying as more parties and independents become involved in the political/parliamentary process, does that improve or create additional hurdles for that subnational and national relationship?
We could broadly classify political parties in India into two broad types. One are polity-wide political parties that compete across India, in different states. Whereas you also have political parties which are territorial parties, which compete only in one or two units or sometimes one unit of the country. Now, what has happened in India is, over a period of time, the non-polity-wide political parties, political parties that are specific to specific states, units, etc., have sort of increased their numbers. Their numbers have sort of increased in Parliament, and the polity-wide parties have sort of been pushed. The seats obviously have reduced. Now, when you have had these state-based political parties in the national parliament, then they do push for a more equitable relationship between the center and the states. Whereas both the two polity-wide parties, that is both the Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party, are reluctant federalists. They would prefer not to have a federation in the first case. So as long as these political parties are dependent on these smaller political parties, and when it comes to a coalition, then there is some sort of an harmony and in terms of federal relations. The moment they don't need these smaller political parties, then it becomes works more in terms of the center decides what is best for the rest of the country. So that's the point I was trying to make between as number of political parties representing different regions increase, there is a change in the nature of the relationship between the center and the states.
Do you also made mention about institution and independent institutions, and are they truly independent from a parliament or a political party or not? And just a general comment, and then I will go to some more formal questions that I've been asked to ask. In the ACT government, because I'm the speaker and probably the political of the three against the four of us, I'm the speaker of the ACT Legislative Assembly, and we have managed to institute independent bodies separate from the Parliament. So our Electoral Commission, our Auditor General, and our Integrity Commission is independent of executive interference, absolutely. Is that a common experience across what you see in India, Mr. Kailash, or indeed Mark or Peter in the Isle of Man or Jersey?
So yes, we have a degree of independence for all of those sorts of institutions. Controller General is appointed by the Chief Minister, for example, but with the in coordination with the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and as a separate governance board for the CNAG, which is independent of government. We don't have a parliamentary commission like in the House of Commons in the UK, for example, but we do have a governance committee which is has a non-executive majority on it, and specific protections around the funding of the States Assembly and the law. And those funding rules also apply to various different non-ministerial bodies. So we have got a fair degree of independence in the system. It's quite new to Jersey because we had I think Peter made a point earlier on, but until 2005, the legislature and the executive were effectively both contained within the States Assembly. It was one entity. So the government was run through various committees, and so you didn't really have that separation, and that's developed over the last 15 years. But we're not in a bad position when it comes to those sorts of examples of good governance.
And Peter?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I mean, the development of responsible government by a particular sort of cabinet style group was earlier in the Isle of Man, but again comparatively late. You know, well into the 60s before we even have the first inklings of it, in the 80s before it's formalised. In relation to non-executive bodies, yes, there are autonomous and quite well protected, I think, bodies which are insulated from both the executive and from the legislature. So, for instance, I'm on the Emergency Advisory Group, which advises the council on the pandemic response, and we were appointed jointly by the executive and the legislature, and we are robustly independent.
Thank you. I've had some questions submitted to me before we came on, but before I move to those, because I'm a political person, I'm the only one of the four, as I've just said. In this divide between national and subnational, does the political party system give more grief or give more innovation to the separation of powers between national and subnational, do you think? In reverse order, I'll start with you, Peter.
I just echo what Mark said in the chat. the Manx political system is overwhelmingly dominated by independents. In a typical world, you will have 20 out of 24 MHKs independent, perhaps more. So it's not simply that we don't mirror the UK parties. So it's not like we're sort of Northern Ireland, where there is party systems, but it's not the same parties as sit in the national system. It's that perhaps because of the intimacy of the small jurisdiction, the party system has never really got a foothold. There was a bit of a blip immediately after World War II in the first two elections after World War II, but even then, the majority of candidates were independents, and the majority of elected people the large majority were independents.
And similar to your experience, Mark?
Yeah, there have been various points in history where there's been a party system in Jersey, and we are in a position at the moment where a party system appears to be starting to develop. So we have various parties have been launched over the last couple of years. But I think it's an interesting question. I'm not clever enough political scientist to know why, when parties have developed in Jersey and indeed in Guernsey and the Isle of Man, they've developed their own domestic parties to suit the issues and the personalities of the day. There appears to have never been any particular pressure or interest in developing parties that are the same as the UK ones. It'd be very simple, really, to set up a Jersey Labour Party, a Jersey Conservative Party, a Jersey Green Party, a Jersey Liberal Democrats. It doesn't ever seem to have happened or been thought about. Obviously, I can see why the parties in the UK wouldn't necessarily have much interest in doing so. There's nothing for them to gain. But we seem to always have a bespoke system, which doesn't, as Pete said, doesn't really gain firm roots. I think politics and life would be quite different if there were those close links. It would make the discussions between ministers and government, between parliamentarians, very different, and create different dynamics, I think, in the relationships. But we just don't see it. So the situation that our colleague there is describing about India is really interesting to hear, and it reflects what I hear about the UK and the relationship between UK government and the Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish administrations, particularly Scotland and Wales, where you have one party in, you have a Labour First Minister in Wales and a Labour or Conservative Prime Minister in the UK, and it leads to different dynamics. But it's just not something we've ever seen, and there just doesn't appear to be any prospect of it either.
I can just chip back in on that. I think that possibly one of the reasons why the party system hasn't got traction in such an intimate context, where there's a relatively small number of electors per seat, is that there is some worry that if you brand yourself very strongly as a party, you may not be seen as primarily committed to your constituents. There may be sort of this dilution of your responsibility, this intimate group you're connected with. And my gut feeling is that if you were not simply branded to a Manx party, but to a UK party operating in the Isle of Man, that would be redoubled. You are not committed solely to your constituents. My God, you're even committed to a party from across, as we refer to it.
Cross, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Look, if we may change tact, and sorry, and thank you for the indulgence in the political discussion. But if we move to a contemporary issue, which is COVID, there isn't a state in this planet that isn't confronted with this. Can you explain from your various places how the effects of COVID on the relationships between the national and the subnational, and has one led to a frustration from another? And perhaps I'll go to Mr. Kalesh on that one.
Again, I will get back to the same framework, that is, it's parties that matter. And what has happened during COVID is the same issue and has worked in a very different way, in the sense that India, like I think most Commonwealth countries, is an executive dominated parliamentary system. So when it comes to even federal relations with the states, it's been executive led rather than the legislatures actually speaking with each other. So we have had, during the COVID, you have had let's say, what is called chief ministers conferences, which is led by the prime minister. So there has been a dialogue between the center and the states, and they have managed issues well. Now, specifically, there have also been health ministers conferences. There have been finance minister conferences, which have brought the center and the states to have a dialogue on a COVID issue. At the same time, you have also had parallel meetings where, let's say, political parties heading governments that are not aligned with the center, having their own conclaves to discuss issues about the COVID. So this is what has happened in India during the COVID period.
And Mark, what was the experience in Jersey?
I don't think the UK government's ever been remotely interested in Jersey's position with COVID. There have been times when there was a time when Jersey was the most kind of COVID infected part of the British Isles briefly. But I don't think the British government ever thought, so we must stop people from Jersey coming in or anything like that, because we're so small compared to the UK. On the other hand, what the UK does has an enormous effect on Jersey. So we are, for example, if we do see the introduction of vaccine passports to one extent or another, and using the NHS app in the UK, which is being talked about at the moment, people in Jersey don't use the NHS. They're not on the NHS app. What's going to be our solution to that, to enable people to go across the UK and take part in an event or whatever it is that's going to be controlled? UK border restrictions inevitably have to come into force in Jersey. UK quarantine rules affect Jersey, and we're very interested in what happens with transit across to Jersey. But it feels like we are the recipients of somebody else's rules, and then have to adjust them. And our specific rules have been quite different all the way through. So for a long time, for example, everybody coming into Jersey was tested at the border for free. And that has had an effect on people from the UK primarily, who thought they were booking a holiday, for example, from what was for them just another part of the UK. They didn't appreciate the constitutional differences. We've got a case at the moment of somebody who is complaining quite bitterly because they arrived, they were tested at the border, one of their party was found positive, they spent their holiday in quarantine in a hotel, turned out it was a mistake, they went home, they tried to claim compensation. Of course, if they went to Cornwall, they wouldn't be tested. If they went to Wales or Scotland, they wouldn't have been tested, but they came here, they were subject to our laws and our arrangements. But in terms of the actuals, we didn't have the conferences that our colleague there described. I don't think anything like that went on. There would have been conversations occasionally, but basically the UK government's taken its decisions, like its announcement last night to change various rules. Jersey then has to react and adjust its position accordingly. And sometimes we go along with what the UK is doing. Quite often we don't. We do something slightly different, or indeed sometimes quite different.
Australia, with its states and territories, has had its own conversations around borders opening and, you know, who can move across. So the Isle of Man, what's been your experience?
Yeah, I'd echo what Mark was saying about the asymmetry, really. So I share the view that I'm not sure that the UK government had any interest in what was happening in the Isle of Man, but the Isle of Man obviously was very much impacted by particular decisions made by the UK. That said, border control was an extraordinarily important part of the 2020 response. So you had very strict, sometimes very, very strict rules on border control. And as Mark was saying, people sometimes didn't appreciate that they were passing from one jurisdiction to another. And this was given more public traction, I think, by the imposition of prison sentences. So a substantial number of people were in prison for failing to comply with Manx rules, particularly around isolation when they came over. And this was very controversial and raised a lot of eyebrows, I think, nationally and internationally. And I think one possibility is that it's actually refocused people on just how powerful Tynwald is and the potential Tynwald has to make real difference to their day-to-day lives. So some of the lockdown rules were very, very contentious. But against that, we had a 6-month period where there was absolutely no restrictions whatsoever. The border control was the only limitation. The Isle of Man was effectively COVID-free. So I think the relationship between Tynwald and Parliament, I'm not sure, has been profoundly influenced, or this is the first national emergency dealt with by Tynwald rather than by Parliament. The public awareness of how important Parliament is to them. I anticipated an increase in turnout in the Manx general elections, which happened in September. I was disappointed, but I'm still getting a sense that there is more engagement with the political process than perhaps there was.
Just on borders, WA is probably the last border to indicate its opening, and the people in WA, as I've been described, is that they're living a dream, because many months of no restrictions whatsoever, because they've been able to maintain quite a strict border control. So it's swings and roundabouts in this ongoing discussion. So just to the three panelists, and again, I thank you. So just, 2 minutes of closing remarks, and if you could, reflect on your experience, but also a little bit of fortune telling about what does best practice look like between national and subnational relationships. And let's go to Mark first.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I think putting this together, I think what I found interesting thinking about this subject afresh was a point that I think both colleagues have made in different ways, which is to do with institutional structures. So we don't, and we lack them. We have them through things like CPA. There's another thing here called the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly and the British Irish Council, which are institutional structures set up under the Good Friday Agreement, part of the peace process that brought peace to Northern Ireland. And they bring together politicians, both at government and assembly or parliamentary level across the British Isles. But there really aren't that many institutional places where ministers or politicians from the Crown dependencies can get together with their colleagues, full stop, or with their colleagues from the UK. And that was really striking when I did the slides and did the thinking about the relationship between the States Assembly and the UK Parliament. I used to work in the UK Parliament, and the point I was making was not only are there very few institutional links, but the primary one that exists through the all-party group isn't actually very helpful from a Jersey perspective, because it sometimes is a place for ideas to surface which are not ones which would find any sort of traction in Jersey. So it's not necessarily seen as a group of friends, although it has that potential to be. And so the issue would be whether the islands or the dependencies in general would benefit from more institutional structures like our colleague from India is describing, where you've got, I know he was describing situations where councils set up under their constitution don't meet very often, but at least there's the opportunity for some sort of get together there. Of course, I think what Peter's talking about with the we also benefit from this informality. There isn't a document, there isn't a rule book. Things develop, things evolve, and sometimes that's to our benefit. And sometimes institutionalizing things isn't helpful. But I do wonder with, I'm no expert in the area of international relations, but when you look at the situation we have with the implications and the ramifications of Brexit, which are felt in many different areas, I could have listed a number of areas where our rules have had to change because of Brexit, and will no doubt change in future as well, because of that relationship between the UK and the European Union develops, and indeed between the UK and other countries. We're just looking at the moment at a possible trade deal with Australia, for example, which might have implications for Jersey. Is it worth exploring that institutionalization to see whether Jersey's voice can be better heard in places like the UK Parliament, where at the moment its voice is not really heard at all? So that would be my closing thoughts, really, having contributed and listened to my colleagues.
Thank you, Mark. I do appreciate that. Mr. Kalesh from India, in a couple of minutes, closing remarks and any comment about what does best practice look like?
I think I could think of 3 points that come up in terms of best practices. Let me start with the first one, with regard to institutions and how they should be working. just like Parliament is mandated to meet every 6 months, or they should be, this is the gap between 2 sessions of Parliament. Can it also be, is it also possible that interstate institutions, intergovernmental mechanisms, institutions are also mandated to meet? That's the first thing. Second would be that, can party whips be loosened? Does the party have to issue a whip on every single issue? So if party whips were loosened for certain issues and left to members to decide, I think there would be greater space for discussion and debate. So, and this actually happens in committees, because committees work outside, or they work in camera, and where members actually, what press releases say is that members actually very freely speak without the party hanging over their head. So I think easing of party whips and allowing more discussion in committees might sort of encourage better both working of Parliament as well as intergovernmental relations.
Thank you. And the final comments from, please, Leman.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yep. 3 quick ones. I think one thing that's really struck me about the discussion today is the difference between small democracies without party systems and large democracies with party systems, including regional party systems. So I think an awareness of the special characteristics of small democracies is useful for democracies. And I think the work of the CPA actually has got some really fantastic potential to give a nuanced understanding of how the values of the CPA are actually rolled out differently according to different sorts of place you're looking at. My second point is, just as the impact of the UK on the Crown dependencies in relation to coronavirus has been asymmetrical, I suspect we're going to find that in relation to constitutional reform as well. The Kilbrandon report, which I cited, was not about the relationship of Britain with the remnants of empire. It was about constitutional reform within the British Isles, the Atlantic Archipelago. And so I suspect to some extent the Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey may be reacting to constitutional change over the next decade, to really get my crystal ball out, the possible fragmentation or partial fragmentation of the UK over the next 10 to 20 years. And my last point is that I think the point that Mark made about recognizing the similarities of the Crown dependencies and perhaps the distinctions from the BOTs and the way in which the CD's interests are not always the same as the UK is really right. And it is possible we'll see something around the British Irish Council, for instance, which I think has got some real potential in terms of bringing together subnational and also the Crown dependency and also national legislatures. And I do wonder whether we're going to see the CTA, the Common Travel Area, under strain over the next decade. And it'll be interesting to see how the different interests of different parties in the CTA play out. So that's my wildly inaccurate crystal ball gazing. So please make sure this is deleted well before 2040, otherwise I could be held to account.
No, I'm watching with interest from down under now. And with that, I was about to, thank you to the 3 presenters for coming on board, and just to remind you that this is indeed, Peter, being recorded and will be available as a webinar on the CPA YouTube site. So you'll have to make another call before 2024. But I do indeed want to thank all 3 speakers for being part of this session, for those online and those that will tap into this through CPA YouTube. It is an interesting discussion, and I think you've pointed out that the relationships between national and subnational are fluid but significant. There's lots of informal and formals, and that they are forever changing. And we haven't even touched on the implications of, constitution and budgets and other things. But it is there for us to work through as small parliaments, indeed, north, south, east and west across this wonderful globe in which we live. Can I thank Acacia for your background support in pulling this together, and indeed the CPA team that always always seems to serve, you know, the Commonwealth parliamentarians across this globe so well. So thank you indeed. So with that, I will bid you all good morning, good evening, or from wherever you are. In the capital of Australia, in Canberra, it is coming up to 8:30 of an evening. It's raining outside, so I'll bid you all safe holidays, and indeed we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.